Hello everybody and welcome back. In this lecture we're going to go ahead and add a couple of objects to our scene. We're going to play around with transforms. So this is scaling, rotating and moving our objects about our scene. Let's find out more. Okay, so in front of us here we have a default scene, and before we start talking about transforms, let's have a look at the three objects we have in our scene in front of us here. We've got a camera, we've got a cube, and we've got a lamp. Now these are all different types of objects, and if we have a look in the outliner we can see they've got different symbols representing what they are. Now that's important because sometimes doing a transform on some objects will change them, and on others it won't make any difference at all. Let's have a look at the properties panel, which in this particular case matches the object properties that we can see over on the right hand side here. So we've got a series of boxes that seem to all be the same, apart from there's no dimensions over here on the right. And indeed, if we go ahead and click and drag or type a number into one of these fields, it updates elsewhere. So typing numbers into either the location, the rotation and the scale enable us to be very precise about the actual value that we want. So if we wanted a cube that was 1 meter on all dimensions, we could highlight all of these fields and type in 1. And we can see there it shrunk it down, and it's applied a scale factor of 0.5. We could also have something that's perhaps really wide, like a base for something, like we made the plinth, like this. So we've ended up with something a lot shorter. And then its position in the world, because we know it's 1 meter high and its origin is in the center, we can actually lift it up by half a meter. And there we go. We can view this from the side and we can see it sat on our global 0 point, almost like where the floor would be. Pretty useful. And we could also move it straight back into the center of our scene if we wanted to, just like that. So we've got lots of choice with being precise. Occasionally, though, you don't want to be precise. You want to rough something out and make it perhaps look a bit more organic. So you can do things by just shifting them around, by dragging them by little values at a time. Or you can control them with gizmos. So you can bring up a set of gizmos over here on the tool shelf. Now the tool shelf itself remembers what you had selected last, and so I don't often use it. However, it's very good for being deliberate. So if I want to go to the move tool, select my object, we end up with these gizmos appearing. And you'll notice that there's an arrow representing the global up in the world, like so. The y-axis and the x-axis, which is great. It means we can constrain our movements. There's also these squares, and this basically says not Z, not X, and not Y. In this case, it would be very useful to move it around, keeping it on the ground, so to speak. So we click this little blue icon here, and we can move it around. And it stays in the same vertical position. Now, you can actually freely move things around by just clicking inside the circle. That tends to be less useful unless you're viewing objects in orthographic perspective, maybe looking at it from the side by pressing number pad 3, or indeed pressing the Y just at the top here, and then we can move things around a bit more freeform, but also know that we're being relatively accurate with where we're putting things, if not precise. So if I wanted to put this maybe 4 units above the ground, I can go and count these cells, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and say I wanted it roughly there. And we can then go in and go, well, hang on a minute, this needs to be 2, and this needs to be 4. We, of course, could have just typed those numbers in. However, not always will things line up so perfectly. However, I would strongly recommend as a beginner, if you can do that. Make your objects so they fit into nice whole numbers, then it's much easier to assemble your scene. And we'll get to assembling a scene in a few lectures' time. So we've got all of these options down the side. We've just done movement here. If I select rotate, we can rotate this round. I can hold down control whilst it's rotating, and we can actually do 5-degree increments, which is quite useful, especially if we want to get to, let's say, 45 degrees. Now I've gone all the way around, so there's 45. Now scaling, you can get some interesting effects happening. Because I've now rotated my object, if I go and scale it on its Z-axis, it's kind of growing all around, which is useful, but not just on its up and down, its own z-axis. So we can actually change which way it's going. At the top here, we've got an orientation, and we can see it's going by default at the moment, and there are lots of options. If we change this to local, because we've rotated this round ever so slightly, look at that, it's not even the z-axis that I wanted. So this has been tilted 45 degrees to the left, and I want to stretch it out this way. And I didn't even realise that was the Z location just by looking at it. Could have probably figured it out, but I was just playing around. But now it's like this. I can scale it and make it a longer version of itself. And this is really useful if you were making a plank or a bar of some description. Now I can also make it narrower as well. And look at that. We've got a beam that I can say has fallen down from the ceiling. Lots of possibilities when you start taking control of things like this. And you can also constrain things and say not the z-axis, not the y-axis, not the x-axis. It's entirely up to you how you use these tools, and I encourage you to play. The next one down here is just to turn on all of them at once. I do not recommend that. If you do that, it's very easy to end up clicking in the wrong place and just making a mess. So pick which one you want to do as a beginner and use it. Alternatively, of course, you may be like me and much prefer the keyboard. But before I go on to the keyboard keys, I'm going to make sure that I've selected the select tool at the top there again, so I'm not inadvertently doing transforms on my model. I personally don't use the toolbar that much, but I do want to show you, you can bring up the gizmos under this drop down on the top right here. See, it says gizmo. We can click on that and actually turn on movement, rotation and scale, and have them on our objects if we need them. The most common one I've seen people use is the move, because it is a lot easier sometimes to just grab this and shift it across a little, rather than going G, X, and constraining it to the global x-axis like so, or G, Z, and moving it up and down. Oh, where's it gone? So what happened there was, as I was moving my cursor down, it got to the bottom of the screen and it suddenly jumped, which is unfortunate. I don't know where it is. Now, there are a couple of ways of finding it again. You can monitor what's happening over here on the transform, and I saw it went down to, oh my word, I managed to put it to -1,000,000. That'll take a while to come back, or whatever number that was. I don't know where it is. It's jumping all over the place. So just be careful as you get to the very edge of the screen, because you can have it jump very rapidly. So I'm just going to come back in here and set that to 0. Because now I know the origin of the object is going to be on the ground plane again that we've got here. So constraining movements is incredibly useful. And we saw earlier that we could constrain locally as well as globally. And we could cycle through those. So let's say we wanted to scale this again and make it just a little bit shorter. We scaled it and it's just too long. Let's look at this from the side again like we were before. And I'll press the S key to scale. Okay, it's just generally getting bigger and smaller in all directions. If I press the Y key, it's now scaling along the global Y. We can see that at the top here. If I press it again, we can now see it's on the local axis, which is really awesome. Now, you will find that if your cursor is too close to the origin or the pivot point that we're going around, when you start scaling, it can be quite challenging. So if you make sure your cursor's further away when you press the scale, you can see that dotted line goes all the way to the middle and we've got far more control. Now, one thing to watch out for when scaling, let's press the Y key twice so we're locally on the Y-axis, is you can push an object through itself. And it may not be apparent by just looking at it in the 3D viewport that it is in fact turned inside out. And that can cause you problems later on. We can see here the Y-axis itself is -14. Let's go in and correct that to just 14 for the moment. So you can eyeball this number over on the side here to make the most out of that. And you can also say not a particular axis. So we can go and move something, lock it to the global Z axis. There we go. That's awesome. We can move it up slightly. And we can even go G, Z, 2 and be explicit on how much we want to move it up by. So let's go G, Z, -5 or R, X, 45. Now it's pointing upwards because we rotated it 45 degrees around the x-axis. Now, all of these operations I've been doing, you may have noticed in the lower left-hand corner here, we've got rotate appearing. The operator panel has kept what we've just done. So if you did need to change this and go, oh no, I meant 75, you can do that. But the moment you go and do something else like scaling, it will change to resize or scaling. So it's important to understand that operator panel, just like when we were adding objects, only remembers the last operation. Even if you undo, it's gone. If I press F9 to bring the operator panel up, it just won't bring up the rotation that we had prior to that. So in order to constrain a movement, what we can do is press G, in this instance to move, and press Z. We can constrain it just up and down. But what about if we don't want Z? Well, we can go Shift and Z, and then it will only move in the XY plane. Now, you can see here, it's not on the ground plane anymore. It's on its local Z. So we're locking out the Z axis so we cannot move there. So I'm going to press Shift and Z again, and it stopped any locking, any constraints. And I'll go Shift Z once more, and now it's on the ground plane. So I know that if I go Shift Z by default, I can move it and it won't get any higher or lower than it currently is. Now, the final thing to go over here before I give you your challenge is just how it works if you're trying to transform more than one object at the same time. So let's delete my pole or bar that I'd created there, add in a cube, move it over here out of the way, and add in a sphere. So mesh, UV sphere. So we have two objects here, and the screen's looking very cluttered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Control and Spacebar to maximize my view. I'm going to make the operator panel smaller and out of the way, and then we can have a look at these objects in the center of the view. So if I hold down Shift, I can select both of these objects. Now notice that my gizmo that I've got turned on, I've only got the move one turned on at the moment, is now in the center of these two objects. So the pivot point is changed from the individual object to the average distance between the two objects' origins. It doesn't matter how big these objects are. So if I scale this cube up and the sphere down and I select them both, the center is still the center of these two objects because it's the origins themselves that count. And of course, it's not only moving that's going to be affected by this, it's going to be rotating. Notice they're rotating around their common center. Moving, well, what we have up here, this 7.0, is just the position of the active selected object. So notice our cube has a dark orange border, our sphere has a lighter orange, that is the active selected, so that's what you're going to see over in this transform window. So if I move something, it's showing the transform of the active object. If I rotate something, it's going to show us the rotation of the active object, but that's not really that useful because we're also moving it at this point in time because we're rotating around a common center. As a beginner, I would recommend just sticking to one object at a time, move it to where you want it, use your views so you can be accurate as to where you're moving things, scaling them or rotating them, and then you can use your properties panel over here if you need to put them in precise locations. So I can go 8.5 minus 5, I'm just rounding up here, and let's set that at 0. There we go. Nice and easy numbers to read. Scale and dimensions, well, let's set this at 1.5. There we go. So it's slightly larger than it was before, but we can add these things together. Two of these are going to add up to 3 meters across. Much easier to handle. Okay, so we've gone through that deep dive into transforms. It's time now for your challenge. Okay, so it's challenge time. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and make a monument that looks a tiny bit like Stonehenge. Now, the actual dimensions don't really matter. I'd like you to just use this as a playground. Perhaps make a couple of them. Use your tool shelf over here. You open up your properties panel with the N key. Bring these up. Perhaps type in some values down here to get it precise. Practice with your keyboard shortcuts, or indeed come up here and use the object gizmos as well. It's entirely up to you. There's so many ways in which you could do this task. I just want you to explore, play, and get comfortable with those different ways. So pause the video now and create this object. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Let's go ahead and make our Stonehenge monument. Hello, everybody, welcome back. Now, let's go ahead and make a tiny Stonehenge monument here. Starting off with the default cube, I'm going to select it. I'm going to scale it, but not on the Z-axis. So I'm going to scale it by Shift-Z. That will constrain it, so it's only on the X and Y direction. I'm going to type in on the keyboard 0.5. And there we go, that's a lot smaller. And then I'm going to scale it on the Z-axis by 2, so it's nice and high. Now I want it to sit on the ground plane, so I believe I have to move it up, so G, Z, 2. Okay, so we've manipulated this object here, we've scaled it, shrunk it down, we've moved it. We haven't done any rotating yet, but I think in order to do that, we're going to have another cube to put along the top here and repeat ourselves again. So we can add in another cube, and this time I'm going to use some of the other options here. Now obviously using the keyboard commands we get a much more finer control. So let's see how fine a control we can get if we go up here and turn on, let's say, the movement. So if I try and move this, it's going to be much easier if we rotate our view. So I'm going to look at it from the side with the number pad 3. And then I'm going to use the arrow here. I'm literally going to click on that and drag it over here, maybe around there. So I haven't been able to be that precise with it. I'm certainly accurate, I'm in the right place, but I haven't got the right numbers. And we can check that. If I open up the properties panel with the N key, we can see I was so close to a value of 3. So I'm going to use this in conjunction with these arrows in order to move things exactly. So I can move, I might not have known that was 3. I might be just dragging it to where it looks roughly good and then going, yes, okay, so that was 3. I also want to lift this up to where it's roughly 2. Okay, we've confirmed that. Then I need to do my scaling, so we're going to have to switch our transform. Now, instead of using these object gizmos like we did before, I'm going to turn those off. And this time I'm going to go over to the tool shelf. So I'm just exploring all the different tools, seeing how they feel to be used. Personally, I'm a keyboard shortcut guy. I will often just press the keys, and in fact through most of the rest of the course I will be doing that, but I do want to show you that these other options are available. Rotate, so let's go ahead and click on that. Do we need to rotate it yet? Actually no, we don't. We want to scale. Let's do the right one. So I need to scale it just on the Z axis for the moment and lift it all the way up, and we can see there that looks roughly right, and we can see we've scaled it on the Z-axis by 2. We've already done that before with this one on the left here, but we could also just type in the dimensions here. So if we know we want it 4 meters high, they're kind of one and the same thing. One's an exact measurement, one's just a scaling factor. The next thing that we want to do is actually squish it on the X and Y by a factor of 0.5. Now, rather than trying to faff around with this option here, which you can see is quite hard to get to sometimes and very hard to control, even though we can hold down Shift to minimize that movement, I can't really eyeball that. Is that roughly right? Okay, that was relatively close. So I can click and drag over these fields and just type in 0.5. Or if you would have found it easier, go into the dimensions and just typing in 1 would have also done. Okay, let's add our final object, another cube, and we're going to change our tool shelf over here. We're going to change it back to select so I can select things easy again. And I'm now going to use my keyboard shortcuts again. I'm going to look at it from the side and I'm going to do a combination of what we did before. So I want it roughly here. I don't know where it's going to need to be, maybe 1.5 or 4, maybe 4.5 in terms of where it is globally. So if we go from the origin here up 1, 2, 3, 4 and a bit, remember we're looking at that orange dot, that is the object's position. Then I just need to do a bit of scaling. Or I could rotate something round, so I can make them exactly how I've already done and rotated it round. But since it's already there, I can see that on the y-axis it's going to need to be 4 meters. And the others are 0.5, so I can type those in manually. There's so many options here. Oh, did I mean 0.5 or did I mean 1? I probably meant 1. I was thinking of a scale factor and typing it in the wrong place, something you'll come across lots. And there we go. I've got a very simplistic Stonehenge, or maybe even a doorway. Awesome. How did you guys get on? Did you try out all of the different options and see how they felt to you? Let me know which one you preferred, and I'll see you all in the next lecture.